New house.
Hey, Hugh.
How's it going? How are
Do you
you
remember
guys?
to pour yourself some whiskey?
That's one thing I wouldn't forget for sure.
Man.
I had a little trouble getting on here on my regular computer, so it took me a second. So I'm right at the wire here, but I think we'll get going right away. So all the people that jumped on at 5 can get to enjoy their evening. I just want to start out by thanking Mike Mullaney. Mike's jumping in. He's a last minute sub. We called out of the bullpen for Kevin Guthrie, who Kevin and his wife Tara, they had a baby girl today. So congratulations to them. And Mike was gracious enough at the last minute to come in and join us. Luckily for us, Mike is very knowledgeable in whiskey and bourbon, and he's going to walk us through. This isn't really about Five Trail, or it's not about Five Trail tonight. It's more about whiskey training itself. In the meetings tomorrow, I know in the Frank Beer meeting in particular, we're going to spend some time on Five Trail again before we kick it off next week. But this is our inaugural. Here we go. We're going to get some regular training, and then we're going to start selling next week with Five Trail. We got big plans for it. I know Beer Capital brought in quite a bit of product, as did we. We got some good programs in place, and we're excited for Mike to give us a little more knowledge today. So when we get out in the trade next week, we're able to sell this brand in. So with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you, and you can walk us through the slides.
Thanks a lot, Hugh. Yep, just a little knowledge, just enough to be dangerous. We're going to talk specifically at the goal for this, and I appreciate your accommodation and being patient with me. I am the B team on this one in the last minute sub. The goal today, we're going to learn a little bit about whiskey production process and then focusing on American whiskey so that you feel a little more comfortable selling in the key features of whiskey category rather than just walking in, showing off the bottle and assuming you can send some in. So that's our plan. Casey, you want to go to the next one? Perfect. This is the whiskey lifestyle, life cycle. All whiskey starts as a grain that's basically whatever is easy to grow and easy to harvest in a given area, given region, is what they started with. In the U.S., that's primarily corn and rye because we grow a lot of it and it's easy and we have for hundreds of years. After fermentation, distillation takes beer to, in our eyes at least, it's more refined state. Don't take that personally. The spirit then ages in wood, which gives it a color and flavor from the barrel. And then finally, what to remember from that last slide on the right there, no matter how much you spend, the whiskey always goes back to the water filtration plant as we're only renting it, just like beer. We're going to talk a little bit about whiskey production process and go through a little bit of regional history now. Casey? Perfect. I should call upon Hugh to pronounce these better than I can, but really this is the direct translation. This is where scholars think the word whiskey came from. Whiskabe or uskabe means water of life. Whiskey involved into whiskey. If it's Scotch or Canadian whiskey, it's WHISKY, no E. Irish, they add the E, so I think that's certainly more correct. US, both are accepted, but you're going to see a lot more of the whiskey with an E. Essentially, it all means water of life, which, I mean, that's truly what whiskey is. Next slide, please. Oh, there we are. I should mention that earlier, Travis Stein told me that there was no way I could get this done in less than half an hour. So that's my goal, to take less of your time. If I'm going too fast, somebody tell me to slow down. Whiskey production. What's that? Oh, Travis, please save your questions till the end. Whiskey production in 5 steps. Again, very similar to beer. We're going to go through each of these in one by one. It's the mash/wort preparation, fermentation, distillation, maturation of the liquid, and then the blending and bottling. Next slide, please. Here's where we start with whiskey production. It's the mash and the wort production. 4 primary grains which help determine the flavors. If it's going to be whiskey, not exclusively, but about 99% worldwide, whiskey is made with either and or barley, corn, rye, and wheat. Traditionally, that was what was ever available in the region in, the 1700s or wherever people started making whiskey. And then the malting process, again, very similar to beer. The starch converts fermentable sugars to alcohol. Barley is most commonly malted in Scotch specifically, and a little bit Irish whiskey. Next, please. Then we mill. You're taking the roasted malt and you grind it to grist. Then the grist is mixed with hot waters. As you can see, it's 135 degrees to 170 degrees, which dissolves the sugars and frees it up to make that enzyme reaction a little easier. In the US, we do that in the mash cooker. In Europe, they refer to it as a mash tun. I believe it's a mash tun in Canada as well. Same piece of equipment, does the same thing, just a different name. In Ireland and Scotland, that sugary water, that beer is washed off, and they know that's known as the mash or the wort, what is remaining. In the US, we keep the sugary liquid from the breakdown, from the mashing, and it's all combined into a thick slurry known as the cook or the mash, which sits in the tun. Next, please. Then it goes into fermentation. Traditionally, these are enormous barrels, oak barrels that can be 3, 4, 5 stories tall. They add the yeast. In Scotland, there's the washback. So this is all taking place in a wood or stainless steel vats. I've only seen stainless steel vats in the biggest production. Even brands as big as, say, Maker's Mark use all wood tons, and they replace staves as they need to. They're traditionally open topped, so let the air and bacteria come in, and they can close them off because it does generate a good deal of heat. When they're done fermenting through this process, you've got an alcohol level of about 8 to 14% alcohol, and that's what's known as the beer or the wash. Water is really what's considered the most key component besides the grains. It's why Kentucky got to be so popular with their limestone filtered waters. It takes out all the iron. Iron really just ruins whiskey. If the water has too much iron or really anything more than trace amounts, it rejects the malting essentially, and the alcohol will be turned bad. It's undrinkable essentially. Next, please. There's 2 types of distillation traditionally in whiskey. You might see some oddball stuff, but again, 99.9% of whiskey distillation in the world is either pot still or continuous still. Pot still is considered artistic. It allows more interaction with the metal versus the column still, and that's supposed to add more congeners and give it more technique. Really, pot still is more traditional as well. You can't make a large batch in there we are. You can't make a large batch in a pot still. They're not equipped. They're not designed as such. So mass production is almost always going to happen in a continuous still. So a pot still has 2 distillations. You start with the wash still, which produces the low wines, which is the next step above the beer and the wash in terms of alcohol percentages. And then the second is a spirit still, which produces the high wines. Essentially what you're doing, alcohol boils at a temperature less than water. So you're doing a low boil that allows the alcohol to escape as vapor, distill up, and then the water remains behind. When you're doing a distillation run, it comes in 3 parts: the heads or the foreshots, the tails or the feints, and the heart, the middle cut. The heads is the first that comes off. That's the low boilers. It's often medicinal and doesn't really have a pleasant taste. And then the tail is the end, which is the high boilers, which actually can be can be poisonous. What you really want is the middle cut, the heart of the run. That's to use as a final product. The hearts and the heads and the tails can be returned to the still and brought back through, but the middle cut is what is collected to go on to the next step to make whiskey. It's reduced to 125 proof before barreling. Traditionally, that's done with the addition of pure water, ionized water or straight limestone water, just to bring it down. And then continuous still effects. The continuous still, it's much more computerized, controllable tool as opposed to the pot still, which again is a little bit more of an art. So you can set the continuous still to distill at any strength. Again, that's used mainly for the mass production. because you're doing lighter elements of the whiskey blend. So you want a higher proof on that just to bring the proof up when you're doing blended whiskey to make sure it's enough. It's a way of stretching your lower or your high lower proof whiskey out by not having to distill as much as slowly. The continuous still can run quick and run fast. There's just not a lot of romance in it, frankly. Next slide. Congeners. Congeners are what makes whiskey taste good. You're responsible for the taste, flavor, and aroma. They come in the head and the foreshots can be redistilled. Really, the congeners are imperfections in a really that's what they are, but they are what affect and give the whiskey its flavor. So some congeners are bad, some congeners are good. As I said in the tails, you can redistill them or discard them, but some may be poisonous. Some distillations will produce a small amount of fusel oils and other acids that can be poisonous if consumed in great deals. So part of the romance and the skill of being a master distiller, or really just a distiller, is figuring out how closely you can cut those heads and tails and retain the heart. That's the best. And that's not only for whiskey. The heads, hearts, and tails is in any spirit you distill, but we're just talking about whiskey today. So that's really where the skill comes in. Identifying and carving out those hearts that have the best taste, while not being overly wasteful and reducing your output. Next one, please. Then maturation. This is where the magic really happens. 5 changes occur, and by the maturation, there's almost all whiskey is matured in whiskey barrels are oak barrel, or whiskey production is oak barrels. It's bourbon that gets the qualifiers of single use, unused, etc. But it's the interaction between the spirit and the charred barrel or uncharred barrel itself. You get the interaction among the grain recipe. Think of it as like chili always tastes better after it's had a day or two to sit. Whiskey's very much the same. You get a chance for all those ingredients to mix and become homogeneous. And then the water and alcohol slowly but surely evaporate through the barrel. Water more quickly than alcohol. So if you put something in the barrel, a certain spirit, the longer you age it, the higher the proof will tick up, because water evaporates from the liquid quicker than alcohol. You get oxidation, the air interplay through the wood with the whiskey or the spirit. Also, whiskey gets its color, its smell, tannins, so the mouthfeel and flavors from the wood. All that comes from the oak and the char. And we're going to get into it more later, but American whiskey bourbon has very, very specific requirements on what you can and cannot add to whiskey. If you're looking at a straight bourbon or a bottled and bond bourbon, there's nothing added. There's no flavoring, there's no coloring. Otherwise, it can't say whiskey on the label. And then lastly, chemical, physical, and extractive are concentrated through evaporation, which makes a lot of sense. Just like I said, you lose more water, the proof goes up, it becomes stronger flavors, it becomes more consolidated. Next one, please, Casey. Oh, this is thirsty talk. Whiskey production, blending and bottling. Barrels are selected and emptied into large vats. You add the purified water to bring whiskey, usually to 80 proof. That's the legal limit. You can't go much lower than that and still call it whiskey. And if you're proofing it down, some brands will be proof to taste. So you might see anything from 80 to 90, 92 proof in a couple exceptions. Otherwise, that's normally you're going to see 80 proof in whiskey. There's 2 exceptions. A single barrel bottling, that means you take one single barrel. You're not mingling a number of barrels or blending. It's one specific barrel, and then all the yield from that barrel is water. The purified water is added, and it's diluted to 80 proof or higher, depending on what they're after. The second exception is cask strength or barrel proof bottling. That means there's nothing added to dilute. They take that barrel, they dump it, they don't mix it with anything else, and they put it in the bottles. Those can run, I've seen as high as 130, 140 proof. They're like drinking rocket fuel, but there's some whiskey nerds who really go after that. I personally think it's too hot, but everybody's got their own personal taste. Next one, please. So this is primarily where whiskey comes from in worldwide. We're going to be focusing on the United States, obviously, because that's, well, the bulk of our whiskey sold and comes from. But traditionally, it's Old World is Scotland and Ireland, Scotch and Irish whiskey. Shout out to Hugh there. New World is United States and Canada. And then others, Japan and India, they're both burgeoning whiskey markets that are making their own and making some really world-class whiskeys. Obviously, they're more popular in their home area, but we do sell some. Frank Beverage is lucky enough to have some great Japanese and Indian whiskey brands that are, in my opinion, much more a Scotch style. That seems to be the preferred style, but they're branching out quite a bit. In fact, one of the primary Japanese whiskey, or the preeminent Japanese whiskey maker, is Suntory, which bought Jim Beam in the last decade or so, and they're making some fantastic bourbon style whiskeys. I think it was 2 or probably more like 5 years ago, Yamazaki won the Whiskey of the World, which is a kind of an Olympics of whiskey, and really put a spotlight on Japanese whiskey. Next balloon, please. So United States, this is where whiskey traditionally came from. Now whiskey's made all over the United States, but initially, again, in the 1700s, it was rye made in the Pennsylvania area, corn in Virginia. Again, this is the products that they had in abundance. In 1791, there was the whiskey excise tax. That's when the fledgling government of the United States, well, not even the United States at that point, but of America, decided that they needed a tax, a hit off the whiskey that was being made. So a lot of the people who were making whiskey moved outside of federal jurisdiction. They moved to Kentucky, Indiana, they just to avoid the tax, essentially. That's really what set the stage for the whiskey boom in Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee. These established whiskey distillers got sick of paying taxes, so they ran far enough away where they couldn't be caught, and they started making whiskey. It was based in Bourbon County, Kentucky, again because of their filtered limestone filtered water. And then in 1897, there's the Bottled in Bond Act. That's an important buzzword. If for a whiskey to be bottled in bond, it means it's put in a locked warehouse for 4 years. It's only the yield of one distillery. It's not blended from any other. It's bottled at 100 proof versus 80 proof. And there's 3 reasons they do it. The taxes are paid only when it's shipped. So for argument's sake, let's say you put 100 gallons of whiskey in a barrel for 4 years. At the end of 4 years, you don't have 100 gallons anymore. You might have 85 gallons of whiskey. That way, you're only paying taxes on those 85 gallons rather than the 100. It also assured authenticity. If it's bottled in bond, that means it's guaranteed. It's locked up. It's inspected by the government. So, it's not a bootleg or a knockoff. If it says it's bottled in bond, it's a minimum of 4 years from one distillery, 100 proof. And then also the government received their taxes because the government was in charge of those locked warehouses. So it worked for both sides. The manufacturers didn't have to pay as much in taxes, but certainly more than when they were just bootlegging. And the customer knew that it was high quality spirit that they were getting. Next one, please. These are the types of whiskey prevalent in the United States. Bourbon whiskey, again, and we'll go through each of these. Tennessee whiskey, rye whiskey, wheat whiskey, which is gaining popularity, blended whiskey, which you are probably more familiar with than you realize, light whiskey, corn whiskey, and straight whiskey. Straight whiskey is a term used for aging standard that we'll cover in a little bit here. So next one, please. So straight whiskey can be bourbon, rye, or wheat. It has to be distilled between 130 and 160 proof. Let me back up. These are all legal definitions of straight whiskey. This is all government required. And if you want to put straight whiskey on a label, you have to check all these boxes. So again, distilled between 130 and 160 proof, aged 2 years, no less, in a new charred white oak barrel at no more than 125 proof. So they proof it down to put it in the barrel for 2 years. You can't add any caramel, you can't add any color or flavoring. It has to be 51% of one predominant grain: corn, rye, or wheat. Barley, United States doesn't play with barley as much. If you want to say it is a straight corn whiskey, it's got to be 80% corn. This is a weird legal definition, but it must have taste, odor, and character of whiskey type. So If you're saying it's a straight rye whiskey, it better taste like rye whiskey. It better smell like rye whiskey. It better look like rye whiskey, or they won't let you put it on the label. And it cannot go lower than 80 proof when it's bottled. Next one, please. Bourbon, the most popular whiskey spirit in the world, really, even more than Scotch of late. It's named for Bourbon County, Kentucky, but it's not limited to Kentucky. Bourbon can be made anywhere in the world. Specifically, or one to note is like J. Henry is a Wisconsin bourbon. As long as it checks the boxes, you can put bourbon on that label. So that's a minimum of 51% corn with rye, malted barley, or wheat to balance it out. Every mash bill is different, but it must be 51% corn. Oftentimes you'll see it as backset, or sour mash is the term that's most used. That means they reserve some of the spent mash from the previous day's distillation to the fresh one. It's not too different from, saving a yeast strain. A lot of these brands, like Maker's Mark, has proprietary yeast that they use in every set. They use a little bit from the previous, and they introduce their initial yeast strain to make sure they're getting a consistent flavor. That's not a requirement, but that's very often the flavor or the preferred style. Bourbon has to be distilled between 130 and 160 proof. And then the difference between bourbon versus straight bourbon, bourbon doesn't have a minimum duration of aging period. Products aged for as little as 3 months are sold as bourbon. They can put bourbon on the label if they cover all their other bases. But if they're going to be straight bourbon, they have to age for 2 years minimum. And then again, cannot be lower than 80 proof. Next one, please. Kind of gloss over a little bit of these. Tennessee whiskey is a different style. And again, to say Tennessee whiskey, you have to do certain other things to put Tennessee whiskey on the label. So it must be produced within the state limit of Tennessee. It has to be a straight bourbon, or is a straight bourbon. So it has to be 2 years aged. Otherwise, you cannot put Tennessee whiskey on it. Those George Dickel on the picture as sour mash. They use that back set. And then all Tennessee whiskeys use the Lincoln County process. What that means is that all their whiskey before it is barreled is filtered through, before it is bottled, is filtered through sugar maple charcoal, which is exactly what it sounds like, charcoal briquettes made from sugar maple. This was popularized by Jack Daniels. It's probably a whiskey none of you have ever heard of. I wouldn't look into it. It's not much. But that is, to be a Tennessee whiskey, they have to be filtered through sugar maple charcoal. Otherwise, they can't put Tennessee whiskey on the label. Rye whiskey has to be 51% rye, and if it's aged 2 years in new charred white oak, you can call it straight rye whiskey. Corn whiskey is kind of a newer phenomenon that's getting more popularity. It's essentially moonshine. It's 80% corn. There's no aging requirements. If it is aged, they can use used or uncharred new oak. It's getting a little play with some whiskey heavy accounts. Mellow corn is a really good example for it. Or it's really not very far away from, White Dog, White Lightning. Next slide, please. Again, with the North American tour, the Canadian whiskey. In the past, Canadian whiskey almost always meant rye whiskey. However, that's no longer the case, as Prohibition really kind of disrupted the market. Rye whiskey was the king of whiskey in North America until Prohibition. But after the United States went through Prohibition, people didn't like rye whiskey as much anymore. They got used to lighter flavored spirits that could be made into cocktails, and rye has a very distinctive taste. So Canadians, being nobody's fool, realized if people weren't going to buy their rye whiskey, they'd make other whiskey, and they make more corn whiskey today. Again, Canada has its own set of regulations. Product of Canada, no distilled spirits less than 3 years old. So similar to straight whiskey, straight bourbon, which is 2 years, Canadian whiskey has to be a minimum of 3 years old. It's almost always blended. You very, very rarely see a single barrel or a barrel pick of Canadian whiskey. It does happen, but not often. They only use cereal grains, which is, again, corn, wheat, barley, and rye. They have to use a column still. That is part of their requirement. They can use a pot still as well, but you must use column still for part of that blend. Again, bottled at no less than 80 proof. A lot of them are imported in bulk. You'll see them make a tanker of Canadian whiskey and then ship it to wherever they want, and then it's bottled there. As long as it's within Canada, it can be Canadian whiskey. A really good example of that is Fireball. Until recently, every drop of Fireball was made in Canada, and then it was shipped to Louisville to become Fireball with its additives, but it'll never say Canadian whiskey on it because of the way they make it. Canadian whiskey is a lot more lenient with additives. You can add up to 9.09% of any component. So if your greatest component is, 50% corn, let's say, you can add up to 9.09% of that, the equivalent, and it can be caramel, flavoring, coloring, whatever you want to do. Previously, before Fireball came to the United States, it did say Fireball Canadian Cinnamon Whiskey because it was technically, and they didn't add so much, that could be considered Canadian whiskey. Virtually every Canadian whiskey on the market, unless it is a single barrel, and even then some of those have some sort of flavoring or caramel additives to it. Flavoring or coloring additives, I should say. Light whiskey is a lesser popular style. It's a lower proof. It's still proofed and made at the same proof, 161 to 189 proof coming out of column still. They store it and use it in used or uncharred new oak containers. It's used to blend whiskey, to bring that proof around, or to get the flavor profile you want. Again, most Canadian whiskey is blended. Next one, please. Oh, which brings us to blended whiskey. Oof, that is one attractive package right there. Blended American whiskey must contain a minimum of 20% straight whiskey. The balance can be made up with that light whiskey we talked about, neutral grain spirits, coloring, basically whatever you want. It's kind of the Wild West. The subcategories are, blended bourbon. That means you've got to have a minimum 51% straight bourbon if it's going to say blended bourbon on the label. Blended rye, same thing, 51% straight rye. So again, that's 51% 2-year aged rye whiskey. Blended wheat, 51% straight wheat whiskey, or blended straight. That means that all of the whiskey contained in that bottle they're all 2-year whiskeys that are blended together. Blended whiskey is really a very popular category, gaining much more steam. Traditionally, bourbon, scotch were the big ones, but blended whiskey is terrific. One way I'd consider it is when for years, people would turn their nose up at blended scotch. Everybody wanted single malt. Scotch is blended to get the best possible taste. So they're blending it to taste as good or better as a single malt. You're not leaving it to what may or may not come out of the barrel. So blended whiskey, they're looking for a profile, they're looking for a flavor, they're looking for a proof. They're doing everything they can to produce the best possible product. And consumers are starting to recognize that. Some really important blended whiskeys are, American whiskey, Seagram 7 is one of our biggest ones. Crown Royal is a blended whiskey. So there's really high-end, good blended whiskey. It's just a lot of the consumers aren't as educated as they perhaps should be. Last one, I believe, is just a slide saying thank you and any questions. Look at that. Steiner, I was 2 minutes under 30 minutes. How about that? Does anybody besides Jeff John have any questions?
Great job, Mr. Mullaney. I knew you could do it.
You're going to make me blush right into this
stuff.
whiskey.
Great job, Mike. We appreciate all the knowledge you're putting on there. I got one question for you. A lot of us are new to this, obviously. If I'm walking into a store, what's some likely things a retailer is going to push back to me on, and maybe some suggestions on how I might overcome those objections? Anything come to mind that you run into quite often?
Absolutely. So you're jumping over one of the first hurdles because you're bringing in a product that people are interested in. Almost every whiskey sells to a greater or lesser degree, and people are excited about whiskey. So that helps a lot. You're not coming in with a spirit that nobody's interested in. Whiskey moves almost in every account, on premise, off premise. So you're bringing in something, you're speaking to their language. Hey, I sell whiskey, you sell whiskey. Here's a whiskey. I think your biggest pushback is going to be the fact that you're working with a blended whiskey. And as I said, a lot of the consumers aren't prepared for that. They're not familiar with a premium blended whiskey. And I'd explain it the same way I did with the blended scotch versus single malt scotch. The people who know whiskey are familiar. You're going to have to work to educate the consumer a little bit. At the end of the day, just because the segment is so bloated, there's a lot of dogs to pick on. And frankly, to add insult to injury, I'd start staring right at that Terry Bradshaw whiskey that's brought to us by our friends at Wisconsin Distribution. They put that everywhere. And when a store turns off the light at night, that one barks. It's not going anywhere. It's plenty expensive. That's exactly what I would target. There's nobody in that section that is taking care of Terry Bradshaw whiskey. All the beer distributor, the WDI employees are worried about the cold box because you guys are beating them up in there. So that's what I would target. They gave it a shot. You have a natural advantage because there's some novelty. You've never gone in to talk to a store owner or a manager about whiskey. You're talking about seltzers and beer and imports and crafts, but you've never talked about spirits before. So there's going to be a little bit of novelty and a little bit of interest. It's something out of the ordinary. Plus, I mean, there's a lot of people asking about Five Trails. I've had customers ask me. I think there's some buzz. So I hope that works to your advantage too. I don't think your knowledgeable accounts are going to be spared off by the price, but there might be some education. Explain to them. You're right, it's a blended whiskey because they're making the best possible whiskey they can. They're using the best source, which is an expensive proposition. And the package speaks for itself, I think. But I'd say if somebody pushes back, it's not a great investment. You're not asking for anybody. Well, you're not asking for a lot of people to buy multiple cases. There's always dogs to pick on. Same way you do in the cooler on the shelf. Ask them what isn't selling. You've got one product as opposed to coming in with, a new seltzer with 5 flavors or a canned cocktail with 7 flavors, for God's sake. You've got one product. And again, there is buzz, and it's got the most powerful marketing machine in the industry with Miller Coors. So I'd lean on all those aspects.
Great advice, Mike. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions for Mike?
Okay, Jeff, you can ask a question.
All right, thank you. So in your world, what is considered acceptable pull through on a product like this? If you're looking at we're used to looking at it in case quantities with beer. Is it 1 bottle a week? Is it 2 bottles a week? Is it 1 a month that a retailer is happy with typically?
It really depends on your retailer. What works for, say, a Woodman's is going to be a really different animal at, Mahen's in Oregon or Sedona. I would tell you, especially early on, you're going to want to see a bottle or 2 a week. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to answer some questions. If at the end of the month, you haven't moved through at least half of that case, are those 6-packs?
6 to a case, yeah.
Yeah. So I would say, I mean, we're coming out of whiskey season. When you move into spring and summer, people drink a lot more light spirits, gin and vodka. That's the popular refrain. The truth is people drink whiskey year round, but you can hide behind that a little bit. Hey, we're not really in whiskey season. So come on, cut me some slack. Maybe don't point out that there's snow in my yard right now. But I'd say you're going to want to see couple bottles, at least half that case in a month, maybe more. I would also tell you, lean on that buzz. You're only new once, so I know that you're going to have the best promotional materials, shelf talkers, shelf call-outs, violators. See if somebody will let you put a bottle near the register with a little tag saying, what it is. The nice thing about whiskey drinkers, for the most part, is they really want to try all the whiskeys. And if it's a whiskey they haven't had before, a lot of times they're willing to give it a try. I haven't seen any reviews yet, so hopefully you can get some positive buzz on that. I can only imagine those are forthcoming. But I would really call attention to it. There is buzz, and most of your more savvy retailers and bar owners, they want products that people are interested in. And I think that this is absolutely one of them. So I would lean for that. And then, frankly, cross your fingers that it sells.
Thanks.
Sure. Anybody else? Man, there's a lot of faces. Oh, does whiskey have a best by date similar to beer and seltzers? Ha! Absolutely not. The only way you can really damage the vast majority of spirits is, well, similarly to beer. You get it too hot, let it sit next to a radiator or furnace, or you let it decompose in the sun. It may look differently, but it'll still get you drunk. I would tell you that the vast majority of whiskeys, if you keep them out of the sun and don't let them get too hot, you're good for years, especially an unsealed bottle. Even especially in a sealed bottle. Even an unsealed bottle, one that's cracked, I've got whiskeys I've had for years. They're delicious. So that's one thing you don't have to worry about. Nobody's ever going to survey looking for dates. Anybody?
All
Well, I
right.
got
One
Thanks,
cube or
Mike.
no?
Oh,
once
Go
again.
ahead, Dave, I'm sorry.
One ice cube or no ice cubes?
This is all personal preference. A lot of the super nerds are going to tell you the only way to drink whiskey is neat. When I first started selling liquor, I would get offended when somebody would tell me they wanted a sign that said Crown and Coke or Crown Mixers because, oh, how could you do that to Crown Royal? It's a wonderful product. I've gotten much more mercenary in my old age. I don't care how you drink it. Just drink it. Really, you don't even have to drink it. Just buy it. I drink my whiskey with ice and just a little bit of water. Traditionally, scotches, you're supposed to drink neat with just a little bit of water, just to dram to, they call it release the spirits, or release the serpent. You'll see an oily haze on the top form as it kind of works through. But it's really personal preference, Dave. I know some of our best salesmen that drink their whiskey with Diet Coke. So whatever's going to get people to drink it, I'd do that. Traditionally, you should probably drink it with an ice cube or two and maybe a little bit of water or neat. But really, however they're going to buy it, go for that. I feel as though that was a novelty question. Dave just wanted to keep me on longer because Steiner bet me I could go less time. But this has been a real treat. I've never done a beer meeting, and certainly not with this many people. Thank you very much for having me. I wish you guys nothing but the best of luck in selling 5 Trails.
We appreciate it, Mike, and we'll be competing with you out there starting on Monday, so.
Oh, buddy, one team, one dream. Don't worry about it. There's plenty of room. We just got to get rid of that stuff from the other guys.
That's right. That's what we'll target. Start with them
Perfect.
boys, so.
Have a wonderful
Have a
night.
great night.
Thank you again.
Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mullaney.
See ya. Later, Dylan.
Thank you, Michael. Be good.